Now, I want to say this about the Soviet Union. Somehow it's not in the book, and I don't know why. But the United States ran a race with the Soviets called the space race. Your book does have a few mentions of it, but not right here in this chapter. But we ran a space race with the idea that we'd get a man to the moon before they did. And it looked like we were losing. In 1957, we decided that we would put a satellite in orbit in 1958. The Soviets knew about our plan, and they put up a satellite in 1957. So the Soviet Union put up the first satellite. Compared to our satellite, their satellite was huge. Our satellite was tiny. And it looked like they were far ahead of it. It really upset the American people, and they said, oh, our education system must be lousy. We must shore up our educational system because they are beating us. Well, actually, the fact is they're behind us because President Eisenhower knew that their satellite was really, really crude compared to ours. And the fact that ours was so small and yet could do more was a sign that we were ahead of them. But I gotta have, they did put the first satellites in orbit, but they were crude. Something else they did, to get those satellites into orbit, they used a long, long, long track that was several miles long. The track would start high on one mountain and fall downward, get to the bottom and go up, and about this time they would break loose from the track, but they would be going quite very fast. Well, there's a problem with that, folks. You might not see the problem, but we knew all along, yeah, they start their satellites by dropping them from the top of a mountain, dropping them on a track. And they start firing the rockets when they're down here, and by the time they get here, they're going pretty fast. There's a problem with that. You can only get a rocket so big to do that. You cannot get a rocket the size of what you need for the moon to go this way. Now, they no longer do this. They now fire from a platform like we do. But again, it showed somewhat of the crudeness of their equipment. Then they put the first animal in space. They put a dog in space. And then they said the dog is going to stay there. We'll never make any attempt to retrieve him. And this made them very unpopular with the rest of the world. A week later, it was known the dog was dead. And they shaved all the hair off the dog, and they put the dog in weightlessness. The whole purpose was try to find out how an animal's body would function in space. Now, it looked like though they were winning the space race. They put the first man into orbit. Yes. And when I was at Lockheed, an old lady said, give them credit. They did put the first man into orbit. And I couldn't answer right away, right then. But over the years, I've thought of a good answer. Yes, they put the first man in orbit by doing what I would have to call cheating. Well, in what way did they cheat? It is now known that they put 8 cosmonauts into orbit, and they all 8 died before the 9th one actually orbited one time and came back down. His name is Gagarin. Now, there's no doubt that Gagarin orbited because the United States was tracking, they're spying on them. Now, we knew about the other 8. We wouldn't tell our own people, and eventually the Soviets admitted, and one of them was a woman. But there was an Italian ham operator who also was spying on them, and this ham heard a woman's voice from space saying, yes, the world will never know about us. So this woman knew she was dying. This same ham picked up a heartbeat. He took the heartbeat to the nearest doctor, and the doctor said, this is a heartbeat of a dying man. One after another, they sent them into orbit, and women, at least one woman. All right, they sent us a picture one time of their cosmonaut corps. They called them cosmonaut. Their cosmonaut corps. And they would send pictures, and one day the picture came, and it was missing their main cosmonaut. And they changed the story 3 times to what happened to that cosmonaut. In the first story, he was at a drunken brawl and got killed brawling at a drunken party. Then he was got drunk at a party and was involved in a motorcycle wreck. He had driven a motorcycle home and got drunk and got killed in a motorcycle wreck. And I think the next story, it was an automobile wreck instead of a motorcycle wreck. We now know they sent him into orbit. And he did not survive the trip. Now, with that kind of record, I call that cheating. It's true we've lost a few men in space, but nevertheless, folks, they did get the first man to go in one orbit around the Earth and come back down. His name is Gagarin. The year was April 1961, and I remember we'd get weekly readers. I was a 12-year-old 6th grader, and The headline says, "You will tell your grandchildren." I remember April, I forget the date, it was something like April 5th, 1961. That is the day the first human orbited the Earth. Well, I don't remember the exact date, but it was April 1961. And I don't yet have any grandchildren, but maybe I'll tell them someday. I remember that date because that's the day the first human, but of course, I really can't give them a lot of credit. We put our first man in orbit several months later. Actually, we didn't start off putting a man in orbit. Our first two men to go into space, Alan Shepard, only flew for 15 minutes. They went up, went 100 miles up, and came right back down in 15 minutes. The next one was Grissom. He went up, same thing, 15 miles. I mean, 120 or so miles and came down. The first American to orbit the Earth was John Glenn. He's still alive. Shepard and Grissom are deceased, but Glenn is still alive. In fact, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Glenn is the only one of the 7 original Mercury astronauts still alive. Scott Carpenter died, and he was the next last. Scott Carpenter died about less than a year ago. But we eventually put our man into orbit. Then we developed a bigger, the Mercury program only could carry 1 man. The Gemini program carried 2, named after Gemini twins. Gemini program carried 2 men. The Apollo program carried 3 men. Now, when you're running a race with a cheat, the cheat will win initially. But in the long run, the cheat loses. The Soviet Union could only get so far in their space program and couldn't break the barrier. The United States wound up putting the only men on the moon. We sent 12 men on the moon, most of whom were still alive. Neil Armstrong died about 2 years or so ago. But Al Bean is still around, and several others. Between 1969 and December 1972, we were to send 6 trips to the moon. One of them almost failed. Apollo 11 made it to the moon, Apollo 12. Again, we took a cautious step-by-step approach. Apollo 13 did not land on the moon, but orbited the moon. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17. Apollo 17 went in December 72. Then we quit going to the moon. Now, I wanted to say that because, again, I'm a big fan of the space race, as you might can tell. All right. Now, I want to say this about the space race. Right at this moment, we have no manned space vehicle. We retired the shuttle. To get into orbit, to get to an international space station, of which we helped build, we're depending on this is Russia now. We're depending on Russia. We're giving Russia $80 million to send any one of our men into orbit, which is money going into their coffers.
Why depending on Russia?
Because we don't have a rocket. We don't have a manned spacecraft.
Oh.
See, we retired the shuttle. The shuttle was getting old. Now, in about 2 years, we might have another one. We're trying to build one. And of course, when you build something new, you always have to work the bugs out. But the new spacecraft we build, suppose we'll be able to go somewhere. Now, the shuttle could not go anywhere. It wasn't, for a long time, it wasn't even able to dock to the space station. Finally, it got to where they built it, modified it, where it could at least dock. But for a long time, it couldn't even dock with the space station. The shuttle was not capable of going anywhere. But this new craft we're building, it's supposed to be able to go to the moon if we want to go there, or go to an asteroid. It won't go to Mars. To go to Mars, you have to carry a whole lot of food and water and fuel that we simply are not ready to do yet. But the new craft will eventually, and hopefully will go to an asteroid someday, and piggyback carry that asteroid into an orbit around the Earth. And then we can use that asteroid as our own space station. And folks, the long-range plan might be to put an asteroid in geocentric orbit. In other words, an orbit where it stays in one place, and then use a long, long cable to lift cargo up into orbit without using rocket power. Supposedly, we can do it, but the cable technology does not exist. We have plans of how one could be made. Have any of you heard of this program like this? You have? Yeah, okay. And again, it would be great because Robert Heinlein told us many years ago, a science fiction writer many years ago, that once you get into Earth orbit, you are halfway to anywhere you want to go. The trick is getting into Earth orbit. If we could get to Earth orbit, Now, there's been all kinds of stories told about why did we quit going to the moon. We want to go to the moon next time, and stay. In the meantime, China has entered the space race. They've got men in orbit. And folk, at the rate they're going, and they're going pretty fast. All right, ever hear of the proverbial race between the rabbit and the turtle? China has been the turtle, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to any Chinese, but you all know in the long run, the turtle won the race. The rabbit decided to take a nap and slept, and the turtle crossed the finish line ahead of it. China has been more or less the turtle in the space race, but they're moving. And if we're not careful, these nations are going to beat us back to the moon. There have been some discoveries made. Now, since our moon program, we've made two really big discoveries. Number one, we have much better computers than they did in the Apollo days. Much better computers. And number two, we have materials called composites. And you're familiar with composite materials. They're very, very lightweight materials and very, very strong that might make for a stronger spacecraft and a lighter spacecraft. Again, we're designing another rocket that supposedly can go somewhere, including the moon. We'll see. But we've scrapped our space shuttle program, so right now we have to depend on the Russians. Now, what I'm getting at is if we decide to engage or provoke the Russians too hard, they can always tell us, no, you can't use our rockets anymore. Or you can't go with us to space anymore. And we'd be simply knocked out until we got our own program fixed. The shuttle was obsolete. The shuttle it wasn't all that great to begin with, and it couldn't go anywhere. But it could get a big, heavy payload into orbit. Now that it could do. Other than that, it couldn't go anywhere. All right. So much for the space program. Again, the book mentions Solzhenitsyn again on page 797. That he wound up coming to the West, wound up not liking it. Eastern Europeans became upset at Russia because if only we could free ourselves of the yoke of the Soviet Union, we could go somewhere. And they began to try to stage rebellions. The first rebellion was Hungary in 1956. In 1968, it was Czechoslovakia. In 1980, it was Poland. The Soviet Union moved in every time and proved we're not going to tolerate change, and they crushed all these. That was up to 1980. In 1990, all the countries of Western Europe told the Soviet Union, go home and stay home. The Russians, but this time they were Russians, they went home and never did bother these nations much again. Now, one thing I want to say about the Soviet educational system, they did not have discipline problems among even the elementary school students like the United States did. But they did manage to use their schools to elevate. Some of your book talks about how that so many children of blue-collar workers grew up to become judges, lawyers, and industrial managers. But they had a problem. I mean, you might say, well, if their education system was so great, why did it flop? And here was the problem. Again, I think I may have told you. If you failed one time, you were kicked out. And I've told you, I believe, about how Michael Jordan was booted off a junior high basketball team for incompetence 2 times. If Michael Jordan had grown up in the Soviet Union, once he was booted off basketball, he would never been allowed to try out again. I mean, we've had most of the men who make it to the top in our professional sports have been cut from the team at one time or another. but our system allows them to come back. That was a problem with the Soviet educational system. And I had a brother who was a spying on East Germany. I mean, he was in the American Army, but he was spying on East German radio communications. He said, you don't know how true that is, because every time we heard a radio operator make a mistake, one mistake, he never heard his voice again. So this was really the big fault of their educational system. They wound up promoting people who had never made a mistake, and guess what, folks? The person who never made a mistake is the person who's never tried. I mean, any of you who played the game of baseball, all right, they bought a baseball player to manage him. I mean, they told him, a great baseball manager, that, hey, we know of this man who played a whole season in minor leagues that did not commit a single error. The manager said, forget it. Any player who doesn't commit an error isn't trying. Any of you who played the game would know what I'm talking about. If you really try hard, you're going to louse it once in a while. It's part of being a good athlete. Again, any of you know what I'm talking about. It just, you know, if you never make it, I mean, you're not trying. No matter how good you might seem to be. Well, the Soviet system had this problem. You louse up, you're kicked out. So again, their educational system in some ways was better than ours. It seemed like they were training their people better, but they did not achieve as highly as Western free people achieved. All right, disintegration of the Soviet Empire, and I'll close. Gorbachev took over, I believe, in 1986 or 1985. He got a program going called Perestroika. Oops. I should write that cursive. And I don't know how that's spelled. Perestroik. Another term I heard a lot about when at that time period was glasnost. These were terms used to say that we're going to try to conform more to the rest of the world. You know, we're going to reform, and as was the case of all Soviet leaders who tried to reform, reform has proven deadly under the Russian system. I mean, they beg for reform and clamor for it, and if you give it to them, the whole country falls apart. Well, it began with 3 countries, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, countries that installed and annexed in just about the time of World War II. These countries decided they were going to break away from the Soviet Union, and when they successfully broke away, all the other 15 republics broke away from Russia, including Belarus, the Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and then the stands, Uzbekistan, Turkestan, Kazakhstan, and any of you can think of any others, but all 16 republics just broke away. And if the Soviet Union wound up just crumbling right in front of our very eyes, it was something nobody could have predicted, but they simply fell apart. And all that was left was, after a while, was Russia, and all the other 15 republics went their separate ways. And that's where the book leaves us. Now, of course, we know that since then, oh yeah, the book shows you, here there's a picture of them. Chinyeka, one of the small ones, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of these others. The word "stan," by the way, in that part of the world means land. Like you have England, Iceland, Scotland, Ireland. In that part of the world they have this land, that land, but they call it stan. Pakistan, Afghanistan. Anyway, 16 republics all broke away, and changed the map of the world. All your globe companies had to make new maps, and are now going to have to make new maps now because they're going to have to probably put put the Crimea as being part of Russia. We'll see how long that lasts. I have a